All right, so let's jump into nCloth. That's going to be in our effects menu set right here. And we have our nCloth tab. We're also going to be using the nConstraint tab to mess around with our nCloth. So to create a piece of nCloth, it's the button right here, but you have to have a piece of geometry selected. So let's go ahead and create just a basic plane. This will be our piece of cloth. I'll scale it up, and I'll also want to add some subdivisions to this. So I can do that just in the inputs in the channel box. I'm going to increase my subdivisions to 50. This will give it more detail to deform with. And then I also want to delete my history. It'll just make it a little easier for Maya to calculate all of this if we forget about all these modifications we've done to it. So I'll delete history on my object. And I also want to freeze transformations. And this is all just to be safe. So I also want to freeze these transforms instead of being a scale of 24. If I go to modify freeze transformations, it now resets it to 1, but it keeps the geometry the same size. So this is a more friendly piece of geometry to create our nCloth out of. So let's go into our nCloth menu and create nCloth. So it creates two new objects here. We have our nucleus, which is again our global parameters for our world. And then our actual nCloth is a separate object from our original plane. So sometimes you'll need to select the plane, sometimes the nCloth. But you should be able to get to this attribute, the nCloth shape, from both places, from either selection. So our nCloth shape properties here, this is where we have all kinds of presets for our cloth. You can change it to silk or a t-shirt or even something crazy like lava where it'll stretch like a liquid, less than a cloth. You can make it very heavy and non-bendable like chainmail. And these are good presets just to mess with, to try and just get very different results for your different kinds of cloth sims. I'm going to start by just not applying any of these presets. And you can see we have this red cache down here. This is a second cache that's just our nCloth cache. So we have our blue bar down here, which is our regular cache, but also a red cache for our nCloth. So we can turn that on or off. If I have my cache turned off, it'll simulate as I play the simulation, but I can't really scrub through it. It only simulates as I play forward in the timeline. And if you have your cache turned on, while your cursor is, or while you're not moving through the timeline, it's loading your simulation. But if I start playing through the simulation, it stops loading this cache. So you have to wait for the red bar to fully load before you can watch your whole simulation if you're using the cache mode. So our nCloth is just falling right now infinitely. So we can turn on the ground plane in our nucleus the same way. Just tick on use plane, so it now just falls on the ground. And then we can add an object for it to interact with. So I'll put a sphere in my scene. And in order to make it interact, we have to make it a passive collider. And that's in our nCloth menu right here, passive collider. So now this object is going to interact with our nCloth, and I'm just letting the nCache load up here. And we can modify the way the cloth deforms around the ball in our properties here. So if I wanted it to not bend as much and be more solid of an object, we can open up our dynamic properties here, and there's all kinds of attributes that we can resist. We can resist stretch, compression, bend. Turning up rigidity here will maintain its original shape. So all kinds of attributes to mess with here to get your desired result. Definitely want to make these changes on frame 1, otherwise your cache might not come out correctly. So I'm going to bring all of these resistances up just a little bit and see what different result we get there. Again, I have to wait for my cache to load. Unless I turn off my cache, then I can just hit play and it'll simulate as I go through the timeline. But what's happening is it's going through the timeline too fast, and I'm not giving Maya enough time to calculate this simulation. So we're actually getting a different result playing through the timeline than if we had the cache turned on. So you want to choose one or the other, either the cache or the straightaway method. I recommend using the cache, but you do have to wait for it to load, and the more modifications you make to your cloth sim, the longer it'll take to cache. So I'll just let it go through the first 50 frames or so. So you can see in this version it's now a lot more solid, it's not bending as much. And I think I'm going to stick with that. So the next thing we can do is attach one of these vertices to an object, or we can just pin it in space to a locator. So that's going to be a constraint in our nConstraint menu set. So if you select just one vertex or a whole row of vertices, this is what is going to be pinned in place. So with one edge of vertices selected, I'm going to go to constraint and I'm going to add a transform constraint. So that creates this new object dynamic constraint here, and this can actually be moved around and keyframed. We're not going to see it update in real time because it's all part of the simulation. Oh, you can see I already messed it up. So let me go back here. I'm going to go into my transform constraint options box and just to be safe, give it a little play. Okay. So this should be working correctly. Now all these vertices on the edge here are going to be pinned in space, and the rest of the simulation is still going to fall onto our sphere. So this is how you would want to attach something like a flag, and you could just add geometry on top of this. So I'll put a cylinder in the scene. This will be my flagpole base. If I hold V on the keyboard, I can snap two vertices, so I can get it right on top of these. And I'm just kind of creating an object, but this object is not actually going to be interacting with our cloth. All we're going to do is parent our dynamic constraint to this cylinder, so that when we animate around this cylinder, the constraint follows. You could also apply keyframes directly to the constraint, but I want to have this object in here. So all I have to do is middle mouse click and drag the constraint onto the cylinder, and that'll parent it. So now I'll set some keyframes for this cylinder. I'll start frame 1 at its original place, and then by frame 50 I'll have it move across this way, set another key, and now I go back to frame 1 and let the simulation cache. Okay, so if I play through what we have, our cloth is following our animation. And it's falling, it seems to be falling pretty slow relatively, so this is another case where I would want to increase my gravity. So instead of 9.8, I'll multiply that by 10 to 98. See if that gives us a little more realistic speed. Yeah, so that seems to fall at a more realistic rate. So I'm actually going to take off that keyframe at the end. And I'm going to attach another transform constraint to the other side of this cloth. So same deal, I'll grab the vertices. And actually I want to show you another way to do this. The first way we did this was selecting these vertices and adding a transform constraint. We can also add a point to surface constraint, and with our vertices selected, we can also select the object we want to constrain it to, and then it'll link those up without having to make this extra dynamic constraint. So let me create another cylinder. And with these vertices selected, I know they're still selected, so you can see it in X-ray mode. So with your vertices selected, add the object to your selection. So select the vertices and then shift select your object. It should look like this. The object should be selected second. So with both of those selected, you can do point to surface. And you can see it creates these lines here, which it finds the nearest vertex on the object and creates that constraint to the vertices that we had selected. So similar idea, but it's attaching it to the surface instead of just to a null locator. So now if we play our simulation, it should just be suspended between these two. And this is a great way to set our initial state of our cloth. So right now, all the properties of our cloth, it's a little loose, but it's in this perfectly flat position. And we don't always want our simulation to start out that way. We want it to start off in a rest pose. So let's let it rest. And then we'll stop our simulation, get to the very end here where it's come to a stop. And with our mesh selected, we can go to Fields, Solvers, Initial State, Set for Selected. So that will set this position as the starting pose for this object. So now when we go back to frame 1, let's try that again. Set for Selected. Let's select the nCloth as well. So you have to have your geometry selected and your nCloth for the geometry selected. Set your initial state, and now on frame 1, it starts off in this initial pose. And even then, it still has a little bit of settling to do, but it's a lot closer than our flat plane. So what I want to do next is I'm going to animate this ball moving up through our cloth, and we can see how stretchy it is. So I'll set keyframe up at the bottom, move it up, and I'll let that start to cache. And there will be a point where the tension in the cloth is just too great, and the simulation will start doing something unusual. So it's just stretching too much, and at this point, there's like one vertex with all of the force of the sphere. So we don't want this. What we would want to happen is the sphere to break through this cloth. So we can define certain vertices as tearable. They can be torn. So I'll go ahead and grab some vertices that I want to have tear. And actually, I'll grab the edges. So kind of do a slightly jagged pattern to give it a kind of cool tear shape. So with some vertices selected, we will go into nCloth. Oh, actually no, it's under Constraint, Tearable Surface. So either edges or vertices selected. Oh, and you have to be on frame 1 as well. I think it made it. So now those vertices can be torn, and our ball is still pretty large, so I'll make it a little smaller. And when I made that tearable constraint, it removed my initial state. So just to be safe, I'll go ahead and clear that initial state. You don't want to give Maya any reasons to be upset with you or crash, because it will happily do so. Okay, so our tear just breaks right away. We want this to be a little stronger so that it only tears when the sphere goes through it. So we can increase our tear glue strength in its attributes. So if you find your third constraint here, this is the tear constraint that we made. I can add the name to it, tear. So in our attribute editor, these are the attributes here that we want to mess with. We can increase our strength and our glue strength here. So if we bring glue strength up all the way to 1, it should not tear? Let's see. So the glue strength is too strong, it's not tearing, so we'll go somewhere halfway in between. Find a good point where it tears right as the tension is building. So 0.5 is too little. The best way to find the value you want is to just half it. So start at 100%, half it. If that's too much, half it again. Or if it's too little, go halfway in between there. So that's why I'm at 0.8. And that still seems to be too little. So I'll go halfway between there. That'll be 0.9. Seems like it's a pretty high value that it needs, so let's try 0.99. All right, I'm going to try this tear again. I'm going to delete it, and I'll just grab a more simple selection of edges. Terrible. Let that cache. Alright, seems like my old tear is still on there, so I've successfully messed up my cloth. So I'm going to take this back a step. I'm just going to clear all my nCloth settings from this. And I can do that with remove nCloth right here. Oh, but you have to have your nCloth selected. And I'll just try creating this setup again. The tearing is just a little bit, it starts to get a little complicated for Maya and starts to not work, but the cloth presets tend to work pretty well with the transform constraints. Just be careful when you start tearing your cloth. It might not do what you want. So that's why I'm trying this again. Let me delete my history, freeze my transformations. And again, I'll create nCloth. This sphere will be a passive collider. I'll pin these vertices on the edge in place. With the transform constraint. Nope, something's still going wrong for me, so I'm going to start my scene fresh. And these are the joys of simulations. So I'll just walk you through it one more time. I'm going to make a plane with several subdivisions. I'll pin it in place. Create nCloth out of this object. passive collider. And let's see if our tear, I'm going to save this scene here before I start messing with the tearing. And let's try this again. Select our edges. Select tearable surface. And cross our fingers as our cache goes. Again. That seems correct. Nice. So if you guys can just get to this point where you have the ball coming through a cloth that is pinned to something so that you have this tear, you don't have to worry about getting the glue strength perfect, but I'm going to see if I can. Because I just want it to have a little bit of tension before it tears. Okay, great. So for me, the sweet spot is a glue strength of 0.4. So you can see the ball comes through, it creates some tension in the cloth, and then once that tension exceeds a certain amount, our glue breaks. You can see our tear, and our cloth falls again. So from here, if I wanted to change the simulation, I can select my nCloth and choose a different preset. Again, I'll save here just to be safe. So if I wanted this to act more like a t-shirt, just more cotton cloth, we'll see a different result depending on what you want. So it's a little smoother. And just with these few things, the nCloth, the passive collider, transform constraints and tearable surfaces, I have gotten away with most cloth simulations that I've needed to do. And there's a lot more that you could do with it that gets more complicated, but this is the extent that we're going to cover it. So this will be one part of our nCloth assignment, and there's going to be a second part. So if you guys just play blast this out, turn that in as an MP4, then you want to find in the assets folder here, I put a start file. Actually, I'm going to make this read only so you guys don't save over it. So once you've made your play blast, go ahead and open up the start file and immediately go ahead and save your own copy of it to your student folder. So this is the file that we've got. It's a dancing character. I just got this from Mixamo, and I extruded the dress down a bit, and this is going to be a simulation. So this is probably the most common cloth simulation, is a character with some clothes. So this is as basic as you can get, and we still may run into some issues. Things like t-shirts and jackets just have a lot more contact points and tough points to work on simulations. So Maya does an alright job with it, but there's other software that the industry uses for these high-end cloth simulations, like Houdini or Marvelous Designer is another really, really great clothing cloth simulating and generating software that can do a lot of cool things like creases and wrinkling that Maya doesn't have the depth of. So this is very straightforward. We're going to create an nCloth out of our character, or out of our dress. And then our character is going to be the passive collider that it bumps into. We need to pin these points onto our surface, so we'll do that by selecting the edges, or the vertices, on the top here, just double-clicking that edge. I'm going to change the selection to vertices just by Control, right-click, and holding, and dragging. That converts my selection to vertices. So with my vertices selected, Shift-select my mesh, and now I go to Constrain, Point to Surface. Since these are all pretty much in the same spot, it's very much a one-to-one constraint. And so let's see what our simulation looks like at this point. So it looks pretty good. Obviously, it's a little low gravity, so I'll increase my gravity again to 98, just multiply it by 10. And I'm not running into the issue in this scene, but, oh, actually, I think I need to increase my gravity even more. Let me try 980. It's still just a little too low gravity. There, this is, it is bouncing a good amount, but it's still being pulled down in a way that I would expect. So I want to add a little bit more resistance to my nCloth here. So I'm going to use the silk preset and see how that result looks. One other important thing you might need to do is increase the number of substeps in your simulation. By default, it's at 3, and substeps are separate calculations in between each frame. So we're skipping from frame 10 to 11 to 12, and we're seeing the result here, but there's calculations done in between all of these frames. So right now we're having 3 calculations of this collision of this knee moving toward the left here. And if your object is moving too fast and there's not enough subdivisions or substeps, your object might clip through and your cloth simulation gets messed up. I'm not experiencing it here, but I'll go ahead and increase my substeps anyway. So you have the nucleus selected because that's a global parameter. And it's just scroll down a little bit right here, you can increase your substeps. So that will probably fix a lot of your issues if your nCloth is jumping around too much. But it will take longer to load the cache because it's doing more calculations between the frames. So yeah, that's looking really great. So this will be the second part of the project, is just play blasting this shot. I'll go ahead and hide my constraint so it looks a little nicer. And I forgot the texture for this character, but I can get that for you guys. So this will be my play blast. Nice. So those 2 play blasts will be the assignment. I do want to show you just one other feature that you can do optionally. So if I start fresh with a new scene, I'm going to quickly make a flag hole with a flag on it. And the feature I wanted to show you was just the wind attribute in your nucleus. So first I create the nCloth out of the plane. I'll pin it, this edge in place. With the transform constraint. And then in my nucleus, I can add some wind, and I can add direction and noise to that wind. So I'll just start with 10. Let's see what that gives us. Bring my gravity up as well. So I want some stronger wind now. So this is what you guys can do if the tearing, if you're not able to break through, literally. All right, so that's very strong wind. Try 50. Also adjust my actual cloth, something a little more solid. So if you want to add some kind of rippling in the wind to your cloth sim, you can do it right there in the nucleus. Great, there we go. That's kind of the shape I'm looking for, is a slow blowing, little thicker shaped flag. From here you can just add a texture onto this, and you've got your cloth sim. So those are the basics of nCloth. Go ahead and work on your projects. Love to see some creativity, some extra push with your cloth sims. But again, they can break down pretty easily, so make sure to save along the way. And that's all.